Greetings sailors and welcome to my preview of the Mutsu, the upcoming Tier 6 premium Japanese battleship. And if it looks familiar, well that's because it is the sister ship of the Nagato. Now you might be thinking that's a Tier 7 surely. Well yes, but the Nagato we have at Tier 7 these days represents the Nagato as she was during the Second World War after an extensive refit in the 1930s. The Mutsu represents more or less what the Nagato would have looked like prior to that refit. This is the sister ship of the Nagato, and this is basically as she was built. Now that's a good thing and a bad thing for two particular reasons. The good thing is that it means you have the biggest guns at Tier 6 with those 16-inch guns, but the bad thing is it means she's got a 1920s AA suite, so that is pretty bad at Tier 6. That is in fact by far the worst at Tier 6, but I'll come to the specific numbers later. The Mutsu herself, well, she's a ship, much like the Arizona, that is perhaps more famous for her demise than anything else. The Arizona, of course, was sunk during the raid on Pearl Harbor. Mutsu blew up at Harbor, and it had nothing to do with enemy action whatsoever. It was a magazine explosion, basically, that pretty much ripped her in half with the loss of most of the crew. And so the Mutsu we have in game doesn't represent the Mutsu as she was when she sank. It obviously would have been post-refit. This was in June 1943, so this is more the Mutsu of the 1920s, basically. So like I said, you've got those big guns, and you've also got torpedoes. And the unique thing about the torpedoes is that they are hull-mounted. However, that's mostly downsides, to be honest. The hull-mounted torps get knocked out just as much as the deck-mounted torps on German battleships do, and you've got two single launchers with a very limited traverse. So don't charge in expecting to be able to tank all the damage and use torps like you would in the Gneisenau or the Tirpitz, because it's not going to go well. But I'll cover the torps in a little more detail later on. So for the numbers, well, what I've done is the usual thing of comparing her to all the other Tier 6 battleships, but I've also put in a column with the Nagato as well, just to see how she shapes up. And in a lot of ways, it's not that different. I think some things have been buffed a bit compared to the what was once upon a time the completely stock Nagato. What they actually did is, was it 2 or 3 patches ago? I can't remember. It wasn't that long ago. They scrapped the A hull Nagato as it was then, moved the B hull down to the stock hull, and made the C hull the upgrade. So this is what the A hull Nagato would have been at Tier 7, more or less, but I think it's probably a bit better than the A hull Nagato would have been, or was in some ways. Now this is the preview version of the ship. Wargaming has, at least this time, told us that yes, there definitely will be some changes, and we know what some of those changes will be. There might be some other changes that come along that we don't know about yet, but probably nothing major. I'll cover those as well when we get to them. So we'll start off with hit points. She's got 58,400, which is the best in Tier 6, or at Tier 6. It's actually even better than the Fuso with its 57,000. So it's got a pretty reasonable amount of health. It's not quite the same as the Nagato's 65,000, but it's not that far off. So it's you know, it's a couple of more hits basically, or it's a couple of thousand more burning damage or whatever. More health is never a bad thing. Your torpedo protection, on the other hand, is not that great. Now Nagato herself has got 25% listed. This has got 24%. Other ships around that at Tier 6 are the Warspite and the Dunkirk with 22 and 25, which is not that good. The Bayern's got 21%, which is also not particularly good. So that is one of the weaker areas of this ship. It doesn't tank the torpedo hits particularly well. Armor-wise, comparing the two in the armor viewer, and I think I'll probably do that at the end of the video, the citadel protection is pretty much the same between the Nagato and the Mutsu. So you've got flat ends, more or less, of the actual citadel section, but the belt armor, the 305mm belt armor, is actually reasonably tanky if you're angling well enough. So it's not bad, but it's not, I would say, an especially tough ship. You can't get in people's faces like you can with the New Mexico or the Arizona, or even to a lesser extent the Warspite, and of course there's the Bayern. I can't really mention those two and say tanky without mentioning the Bayern as well, which is a very tough ship. So this is definitely not in that league, but then the Nagato at tier 7 isn't an especially tanky ship either. But that 305mm belt armor is still, it's okay. It's the same that the Fuso gets, so if you can angle reasonably, you will bounce shots off that. It's just don't expect to be anything like as tanky as some of the other ships at tier 6. The guns, well, as I've said, it's the 410mm guns of the Nagato, but you have different shells. And we've had confirmed in the shiny new Discord channel that we have now with EU. We've kind of upgraded from Skype. It's a lighter type of shell, and so therefore it has less penetration. So you will maybe not get some of the pens you would get with a Nagato's guns. And also, these being this caliber of gun at this tier, some of the cruisers you're going to meet especially, you can expect a fair number of overpens. But against battleships or against cruisers at closer ranges when you've got a clear shot at the Citadel, they can be quite devastating. So you've got, much like the, well, exactly like the Nagato, it's the same class of ship basically, 4 twin turrets with those 16-inch guns. They will have a reload of 30 seconds. The preview version's got 35, which was not particularly comfortable, but it was workable. It just limited your damage output a bit, considering you've only got 8 of them. But yeah, the buff to 30 seconds is definitely going to be a nice bit of quality of life improvement. The turret turn time, 47.4, which is actually pretty good. In fact, it's exactly the same as the Nagato, but it puts it ahead of everything except the Dunkirk with its very, very nippy 36 seconds. So 47.4 is actually alright. And again, this is a thing that was buffed. It was over 50 seconds when we had it to play. The range is 20.4 kilometers, which is about 100 meters better than the Nagato, as near as we can tell. You know, it might be slightly less than that or slightly more, but they round it to a single digit, so it's about the same as the Nagato. If you're expecting to be able to sail around and pelt people at long range like you see people doing in the Fuso, that has the benefit of having more guns, even though they're smaller guns. Just the weight of firepower gives you more chances to do damage. You can't afford to do that when you are packing, what is it, like 2/3 of the firepower, so you have to place your shots a bit more carefully. You can't really pray and spray like you can in the Fuso with its lots of guns and fast reload. The dispersion is the same as the Nagato, so it's not especially good. That's another reason not to sail around and fire at max range. You're not going to hit a lot, basically. I think the kind of the comfortable range is maybe sort of 15 kilometers or less. But you probably don't want to let people get too close because, as I've said, the armour, it's okay, but it's not great. And especially against other battleships at closer ranges, you're going to start taking a lot of damage. Now, the very good news with having those bigger guns is that you've got the best AP Citadel damage at tier 6, 12,400. So you can smack people hard when the guns behave themselves. It's very slightly less than the Nagato, but it's about the same. The next best is, of course, on the Warspite and the Bayern with their 15-inch guns, and then the 14-inch guns ships all have around 10,000. The Dunkirk is just under that. The HE is pretty much, as far as I can tell, the same as on the Nagato, so 6,500 potential damage for an HE Citadel with 30% fire chance, though that's not especially good considering the caliber of the shell. There are other ships with smaller guns that have a better fire chance. In fact, the Dunkirk's always kind of been the standout at this tier because it's got the smallest guns, but it's got one of the highest fire chances at 35%. The Bayern's also got a nice fire chance, but the shells do slightly less damage. The AP and HE velocity are around about the same. The AP shells are actually slower than on the Nagato. Not by a huge amount, but yeah, it's enough to be noticeable. They don't feel especially fast, these shells, so you will need to give a fair bit of lead. It kind of felt like playing the North Carolina, where you do have to give quite a lot of lead. And of course, at the longer ranges, that gives people ample time to dodge out of the way, especially these days with the new captain skills, when you can tell potentially exactly how many ships are pointing their guns at you. Now, on to the torpedoes, which is, of course, the novelty of this ship. I really do think they are a novelty. Now, you'll get to see them in action in this game and the next game as well, in fact. So, it kind of proves that they do come in useful sometimes, but the circumstances under which you can use them are quite limited. And it's all down to those arcs and the fact that it's a pair of single mounts. So with the arcs being as they are, you have to be fairly broadside to somebody, and I learned very quickly trying to use them offensively, it's not worth it. It really isn't. If you're trying to pull up broadside to an enemy battleship, they will just spank you so hard, especially things like Fuzos and New Mexicos where they have a lot of guns available. It can go very badly, and for the damage that you can do in return with those torpedoes, it's not worth it. You've got 2 on each side with that fairly limited arc. They do 10,800 damage each, and they're actually relatively slow as well. It's 57 knots. So the only time you're going to be able to use them to give a knockout punch is against an enemy that's already low health, basically. And they do make a somewhat effective defense against somebody trying to rush you, to ram you, and that's exactly what you're going to see in this game. But it only worked because the target was low health. If they'd been very healthy indeed, then it would have annoyed them a bit, but it wouldn't have stopped them, and I would have consequently died. So, yeah, like I said, they come in useful sometimes, but the circumstances under which they do come in useful are really quite limited. The one good point about them, well, the one truly good point is that they reload quickly. They've got 21-second reload. They've also got a pretty usable range at 7 kilometers as well, but if you're firing them off at 7 kilometers, you're probably not going to have that much success even. You'll probably want to leave off firing them until you're much closer. Now, of course, bear in mind, when I was playing this, I had the element of surprise on my side. A lot of people won't know that the Mutsu is an upcoming thing that has torpedoes, and so they won't know to be wary of those torpedoes. It's like when I was testing out the Tirpitz. Nobody knew it had torpedoes, so you could get away with stuff. Once this ship comes out, once people start to see it around a bit more, and they realise it has torps, yeah, people might be a little more cautious about getting that close, but they're also going to know the limitations of those torpedoes. So, overall, yeah, for the very occasional times they come in handy, it's nice to have them. But don't go thinking that you can be a Tirpitz or a Gneisenau or a Scharnhorst and, you know, get in there and tank all the damage and unleash torps in somebody's face. They won't work for you in that way at all. On to the secondaries. You've got basically the same suite as the Nagato. In fact, you've got 2 more guns than the Nagato has. You've got an extra pair of 140mm mounts. But overall, the secondaries are a bit disappointing. Now, like the Nagato, all of your 140mm mounts are AP throwers, which is less useful than HE overall. And although you've got the same twin mount twin mount 127mm guns, which also double as AA guns, which are HE throws, the range is actually less than the Nagato. You've got 4 kilometer range with these secondaries. Most of the other tier 5s, well, I say that actually, it's a fairly even split between 4 kilometers and 5 kilometers. I'm about to say most of the other tier 5s have at least 5 kilometers, but no, it is a fairly even split. So let's say the New Mex, the Fuso, and the Arizona have all got 4 kilometers. Warspite, Dunkirk, and Bayern all have 5. So 4's actually not especially bad. It's just the fact that so many of your secondaries are AP throwers that limits their utility a bit. So the secondary suite isn't awful, and of course you can buff that with captain skills. I was sailing around with my Yamato captain, so I did have the benefit of AFT, I believe, but not BFT. This, by the way, this is the guy that was going to try and ram me, I think because I was fairly high health and he wasn't. And I could see what was going through his mind, and although in theory I think I could outrun him, instead I decided to see quite how useful the torps would come in. So, while we're watching this, I shall go over the AA rating, which is bad. It is truly the worst thing about this ship. Now, to put this in context, the total amount of DPS you get is 61, and that's worse than, I think, the Kaiser at tier 4. In fact, I'll just do a quick check. Yes, the Kaiser gets around about 84. The Wyoming can get a total of 111. The Miyogi gets 55, so you beat the Miyogi at least. But yeah, 61 is terrible. 61 is enough to maybe scare off a tier 4 carrier, except I don't think you can see a tier 4 carrier in this thing. So if there's a carrier on the enemy team and they know how weak your AA is, you're going to be in trouble. And in fact, the second replay is going to be a game where a carrier just came for me over and over and over and over, and it got a bit annoying. Now, it could be worse. The one thing that does set it apart from the tier 4 battleships is it's got a better range. The outer envelope is 5 kilometers, and that's your best DPS as well. But having said it's your best DPS, it's only about 40-ish. So, you know, you could take the manual AA skill, but that would only bump you up to about 80, 90, something like that, which is not a huge amount. The rest of the tier 6 battleships all have at least 100 DPS total. The Dunkirk is probably the next weakest, with its easy to knock out, relatively few mounts. It's only got 106 total DPS. But even though with a manual AA focus skill, it doesn't buff those 130 mil secondaries that much. You're still going to get more benefit than you will on the Mutsu. So yeah, that is bad. Like, if you get a carrier in a game and they come for you, especially if it's a tier 7 or a tier 8 carrier, even a tier 6 carrier, or a tier 5 carrier, just any carrier, you're in trouble. So, you know, if you want to be absolutely sure of being safe against enemy carriers, division up with somebody in a Cleveland, because you're going to need that protection. Speed, well, 26.5 knots is actually better than the Nagato, and it's better than everything else except the Dunkirk, which, of course, you know, one of its few true positives. I mean, it does have some, but it's the speed of the Dunkirk. Now, this isn't quite that fast, but 26.5 is still pretty decent, and it will let you outpace most of your contemporaries. Now, it's not quite fast enough to keep pace with cruisers, but overall, I found it to be quite reasonably mobile. Turn radius 770 meters, the worst at this tier. It's the same as the Nagato, as is the rudder shift, 13.7. Yeah, the turn radius especially I found to be a problem when trying to dodge torpedoes, which did happen a couple of times, especially trying to dodge air-dropped torpedoes. You're going to have a very hard time doing that, because, you know, your defenses are very weak in that regard. And plus, you can't really dodge the incoming torps. So bear that in mind. This does have a relatively wide turning circle. The rudder shift isn't too bad, though. 13.7 is probably a little better than average for tier 6. That's another thing that is getting improved. The version we have is 14 point something on the preview ship. So it's actually going to improve a little bit, which is nice, but it still it does feel like it handles relatively stiffly in the water, just because of that turn radius. Lastly, surface detection, slightly better than Nagato at 16.9, but that's not great for this tier. That is joint worst with the Dunkirk. Well, having said joint worst, of course that's not true. The Fuso is by far the worst at 18.9 with that big pagoda mast, but 16.9 is still not particularly good. Now that is the base camo. Of course, it comes with a camo which bumps it down to 16.4, which is still not great. With the captain skill, you can get it down to 14.5, and of course everything together, it is a flat 14 kilometers, just like the Dunkirk, which is not too bad. But unless you've got a Japanese captain with a concealment expert that you want to drop in here, you're probably not going to have the benefit of that. So you are going to get spotted relatively early. Not as early as a Fuso, but still, they will see you coming quite far off. The air detection, 13.3. I'm going to be correct this time and say that it is the worst at tier 6. It's exactly the same as the Nagato. The next worst is, I believe, also the Dunkirk at 12 kilometers. Fuso is 12.2. Okay, so that's the next worst. But yeah, 13.3 makes it the worst in terms of air spotting. Lastly, consumables. It's the completely standard setup at tier 6. So you've got damage control party, plus a heal, plus a spotter. And honestly, the spotter I've found mostly useful for having to give an indicator of incoming torpedoes, basically, or maybe spot destroyers. The Yamato captain I've got has the double plane skill, although on the Yamato I use a fighter rather than a spotter. But as the spotter's what's available, yeah. I didn't use it for the extra range. There's no point using it for the extra range, because if you're trying to fire at like 22 kilometers or whatever else it gives you, then you're not going to hit a lot at that distance. It might come in useful if you're trying to run away from a tier 8 battleship, and that range is the only way you can sort of keep safe, as it were, but otherwise the extra range is not that good. So there we are. Overall, it's not bad. The AA plus the relatively wide turning circle, they are by far the biggest weaknesses. But when you can get those guns to behave, it's pretty nice. And I think with the improved the reload, with that going down to 30 seconds, that's going to be really very nice. So, yeah, overall, it's not the most comfortable ship in the world. And of the tier 6 premium battleships, I'm not sure I would necessarily choose this one for fun, or even as a credit maker. But as a Japanese captain trainer, well, your other options are the Mikasa and the I can't even say the word, the Ishizushi. So it is by far a better captain trainer than those. So I think if you're going to spend money on this as a premium ship, that's probably what you're going to want it for, is to put your Japanese battleship captains in and to double up on your dailies, because it does benefit from a lot of the captain skills that you would use on your other Japanese battleships. So, personally, if I was picking out ones just to play for fun, I probably would rather take the Warspite, or perhaps, depending on the mood I'm in, I might maybe take out the Dunkirk. But although I would not say this is the most exciting ship overall, it could be very useful for some people, and sometimes those big guns with the high citadel damage you can do can come in very useful. So I'll talk a little more about this replay now I've gone over the stats in detail. The last game I picked out, it was a relatively, dare I say, almost boring game, but it was also the highest damage game I managed to have in about, I don't know, 10 battles, something like that. So obviously with the quicker reload, I think 150, 160, 180k damage games are probably quite possible, and those ought to be relatively profitable as well. But for the most part, I was, with the longer reload, slightly struggling to get to 100k, and I think this game is going to be around about 100k. But, well, for whatever reason, this carrier player, I mean, he's made one drop on the Nuremberg, and then he noticed I was there, and, well, from this point forward, every single torpedo drop is going to be against me. Yeah, I'm not going to have so much fun in this game. Now, I don't know if it's because I'm the only battleship on this side of the map, which is entirely possible, or if it's that the carrier player went, ooh, that's a new ship, I must sink it. So, either way, with the horrifically weak anti-aircraft suite that I've got, I knew I was in for a rough time. Now, I do shoot down some planes. It is only a tier 6 carrier, but even so, it's not going to be enough to stop this guy. And with the AA suite in particular, the twin mount 127 mils, you've only got a couple of those. You've only got a couple of 40 mil guns, and then I think you've got like 3 7.7 mil, like machine guns basically. So I had a couple of games where I lost, I think, every single AA mount. And that can happen in the Dunkirk as well, but the Dunkirk at least gets a bit more DPS and slightly better range to play with. So expect to see, especially with the 40mm guns, expect to see the medium caliber AA incapacitated message quite often, because it will happen quite often, because you've only got like 2 of them or something. So I've managed a bit of damage so far in this game, nothing spectacular. I mean, I think the Graf Spee that was here has gone down already, so it's sort of me versus a battleship, which I'm not too concerned about, but, you know, I'm pretty certain, or I was pretty certain at this point, that the carrier was gunning for me. Now, we've got our own ship. In fact, this might have been tier 5. It might have been tier 5 carriers. I think it was, because it was a Bogue on our team. I just remembered that, so it must have been a Zuiho on the enemy team. Or is it a Ryusho that's tier 5 for the Japanese? I can't remember. But either way, tier 5 carrier. So we had a strike Bogue. At least I'm pretty sure it was a Bogue. Was it an Independence? Either way, it was a strike American carrier. No fighters. Their carrier was concentrating on me to the extent of having his fighters fly around overhead to protect against the non-existent American fighters that might come and try and interfere with me. So I don't think this was a particularly good carrier player just on that basis. Now, this is another time when the torpedoes came in useful. Not enough to kill him, but with that amount of health, somebody else should surely. I thought he was trying to ram me, which is why I went for that maneuver. So yeah, it's not been a fun time so far with the carrier, and it was kind of made all the worse by knowing that our carrier couldn't do anything about it, and that their carrier was not even that good of a player if he hadn't noticed that he didn't need to keep his fighters here, because there weren't any enemy fighters for him to worry about. Now, it was good news for our carrier, though, because it meant he could just send his strike wing out with impunity and not have to worry about those Japanese fighters, because they were hovering over me for some reason, as if I might disappear and be unspotted. Now, it turned out, yeah, it is the Zuiho. Okay, there we go. It turned out he was really close at this point, which meant he was getting a really quick turnaround on his planes. And I think at this point I realised, having run aground trying to avoid that battleship earlier, you know, I'm now pretty much screwed. I'm at very low speed. My AA is not going to protect me, so this is probably going to be painful. And my damage control is also on cooldown right now. So I'm manoeuvring not to run aground again. There's also a Full Attacker back there spamming me with HE. I mean, I've got the Nuremberg with me who, you know, he's giving some extra AA support, but it's not probably going to be enough. So I do a thing here. I know I'm probably going to die anyway, but this is definitely guaranteed to get me killed. I manoeuvred such that I could put my torps out against the Zuiho, But with the turn that I pulled to do that, well, it's made me extra vulnerable to torpedoes. Now, like I said, I was probably going to die anyway, but I've definitely guaranteed it at this point. So there we go. That's 2 I took, and I might even have avoided this, avoided that 3rd one, but I don't know, I turned the wrong way. However, I got my revenge. So even though I died, it was quite satisfying because I was able to torpedo that Zuiho right back in the face. So we ended up winning that game. I didn't bother putting the rest of it in. It ended up that the rest of our team in the east basically mopped up over there, and the enemy for attacker ran away until their team ran out of points, and so that was that. It was a relatively boring rest of the game from that point. So, for all the planes that came for me, I only shot down 6 of them in the end, even though, you know, the carrier was a tier lower than me. It was still, like I say, it's basically tier 4 battleship AA. It is bad. It is really, really bad. Bear that in mind. But in all other regards, I think it's an okay ship, and with the buffs that it's getting upon release, I think it ought to be reasonably comfortable. I mean, it's actually getting a better rate of fire than the Nagato has. 30 seconds versus 32. So I think it might well be worth your money, especially if you want a Japanese battleship to train your captains in. That, to me, is the thing that this is most useful for. As a ship for making credits, as a ship for having fun in, I'm a bit more lukewarm on it, on that particular side of things. But for the captain training in particular, yeah, I mean, it's about time that the Japanese got something, you know, a battleship that was over tier 4. Because with the Americans, you've got the Missouri, which not only absolutely craps out credits, but being a tier 9 is also going to be a fairly good captain trainer as well. So tier 6, you know, you're not going to quite get the XP that you might get in a tier 9 game. But with the way that XP is calculated in warships, it's not like World of Tanks, where higher tier is always better in terms of XP. Higher tier is always better in terms of credits in warships, but with a good game in this, you can make enough XP to make it worthwhile, I think. So, yeah, that's the value of this thing, I would say. So, there we are, my thoughts on the Mutsu. Like the other battleships at tier 6, the other premiums, it's got its own quirks and peculiarities. It does, I think it fits in reasonably well. I mean, all of the tier 6 premium battleships do have, like, they're all kind of idiosyncratic in some way. But, you know, in terms of just its raw firepower, the amount of damage that you could potentially do with the better reload and the better turret turn, I don't know, it kind of, it fits in, like, it doesn't feel overpowered. I think it fits in quite well at tier 6. So, one last thing before we finish this video off, we're going to take a quick look at the armour. Now, overall, it is worse than the Nagato, which is probably why it is faster than the Nagato. It's carrying less armour. The overall armour is not that different, but once you compare the two in the armour viewer, you start to see that there are a few significant differences. Now, the fore and aft armour is 25mm, deck armour partially is 70mm, and that's the same on the Nagato, and I think the superstructure armour is going to be the same as well. But once you bring up the Nagato, you notice a few significant changes. Now, the biggest ones are the torpedo bulge on the Nagato covers a lot more of the ship, so even though there's only 1% difference in the damage mitigation, the actual utility of the torpedo bulge is way better on the Nagato than the Mutsu. On the Mutsu, it really only covers the midships towards the aft section, and it's far less extensive, and it's just, you know, less thick, so it's overall weaker. Now, if we strip away the plating view and the superstructure, we also notice the turret armor and the barbette armor are significantly different as well. On the Nagato, the turret face and the barbette are 430 and 457 millimeters, and the turrets front and sides, the rear is obviously not quite the same, but front and sides 229. Now on the Mutsu, it's 305 as it is with the central belt armour. We've got 305 on the faces, 229 on part of the sides, and then 178 on the aft portion of the turret, which is actually worse than the rear armour of the turret. So I'm not quite sure why that is. So these are potentially a lot more vulnerable to being knocked out than on the Nagato. And so you might find yourself losing turrets more often than you would in the Nagato. I was actually taking a quick look at the Fuso as well, and it's pretty much the same story, except they've got 229 all round the front and sides, but it's still that 305mm. And on the Fuso, getting turrets knocked out is not an uncommon experience, except you've got 6 of them, so it's not that disastrous. Whereas, of course, with the Mutsu having the fewer guns, bigger guns but fewer guns, it is going to be more significant. Now, if we strip away the casement armor and the turret armor, I've lost the word there. Citadel, there we go, it says it on screen. The Citadel is, I think, a little worse. I mean, it's the same shape, but I think the Citadel armor is improved on the Nagato. So you've got the fore and aft deck armor, 197 there, 289, and it's sloped, and it's still sloped with the foredeck bit, but that part there, the 76mm, that's actually fairly weak, and I think that's the same on the Mutsu. So you don't want to show broadsides. I mean, it's weaker still on the Mutsu, and even though overall it is weaker, I mean, it is not a strong ship at all. The playstyle is probably not that dissimilar from the Nagato in terms of when you want to show your armor, and you can tank some damage onto that central belt, but overall it's a reasonably fragile ship, and you should treat it as being a reasonably fragile ship. Don't sail along broadside and expect to get away with it for very long. It'll be sheer luck if you do. And it's the same with the Nagato. If you sail around like that in the Nagato, you're going to get punished sooner rather than later. So it's a fragile ship, and you should pretty much treat it as such. So, having said all of that, hopefully you found this video useful. If you have, you can hit the like button. You can leave any comments below. You can sub to my channel if you haven't already. And, as always, stay tuned for more.